David Fincher is known for his just total obsession. Dozens of takes, total control, precision down to the smallest detail. But here's the problem. He spends an extreme amount of time and energy perfecting things the audience doesn't even notice, while bigger story issues sometimes go completely untouched. And that obsession has become a huge part of his identity. It's what people point to when they talk about why his movies feel the way that they do, why they feel so sharp. They talk about the number of takes, the precision, the control of the camera. And on the surface, all of that makes sense, especially when you're talking about his movies like Zodiac or like The Social Network. Everything in these movies, they feel exact. The camera doesn't drift around. The performances, they don't feel loose. They feel tight. And nothing that you're watching feels accidental. It all feels perfect. And when you look at some of Fincher's best movies, it's easy to assume that the reason that those movies work is because of that control. The more control the director has, the better the movie becomes. But that's where things start to break down, because the audience doesn't experience movies the way the director makes them. They don't see the difference between take 12 and take 48. They don't notice whether a glass was placed 2 inches to the left or 2 inches to the right. What they feel is the story. They feel pacing. They feel tension. They feel whether something is working or not. And this is where Fincher's process starts to feel misaligned. Because while he's refining these microscopic details to perfection, there are moments where the bigger picture doesn't quite hold together. Now, to be clear, when everything is aligned, that obsession is exactly what makes Fincher one of the greats. Because in a movie like Seven, the foundation is already doing most of the work. The structure of Seven is simple, but it is so strong. We got the 7 deadly sins, 7 crimes, each one escalating in tension. So from the very beginning of Seven, the story has extremely strong direction. It has momentum already built in, and it has something to build towards. And what Fincher does with that is refine it. That is his gift, because at his best, he isn't using his obsession to fix the movie. He's using it to sharpen something that was already strong to begin with. And you can see that same alignment in Gone Girl, but this time it's doing something slightly different. It's controlled in a colder way. Everything feels calculated. The performances, they're restrained. The pacing is deliberate, and that matters because the entire story is about control, and it's about perception and who's manipulating who. So when Amy's perspective takes over and the structure of the film shifts, it doesn't feel jarring. It feels precise. Feels like it's supposed to move like this. Like the movie has been guiding you there the entire time. Even the way information is revealed, what you know, what you don't, and when you find things out, it's all timed perfectly. And it's not there to impress you, but to control how you feel. And that's where Fincher's obsession works the very best. When it's not just making something look perfect and precise, but it's shaping how the audience experiences the story itself. And then there's The Social Network, which might be the clearest example of all, because on paper, this shouldn't work the way that it does. It's mostly just conversations, people in rooms talking, and that's it. But the way Fincher directs it, it never feels static. The opening scene tells you everything you need to know. 2 people sitting at a table, but the pacing of the dialogue, the rhythm of the cuts, the way that the camera holds just long enough, it creates tension out of nothing. You can feel the conversation slipping. And by the time it ends, it doesn't feel like a normal breakup. It feels like the beginning of something much more. And that control carries through the entire movie. The depositions, the cross-cutting between timelines, everything is structured to keep the story moving, even when nothing physical is actually happening. And that's where Fincher's obsession is doing exactly what it's supposed to do. You don't notice it. You can just feel it. But that's the key. All of that only works when the foundation is already strong, because when it isn't, that same obsession starts to do something very different. And you can see that in the game because on the surface, it still looks like a Fincher movie. It feels like a Fincher movie. The framing, it's precise, the camera movement, controlled as usual. Everything feels deliberate. But the deeper you get into the story of the game, the less it holds together. The entire premise of that movie depends on this massive, perfectly coordinated system that somehow predicts every decision the main character is going to make. Every location, every interaction, every outcome, all lining up exactly the way they need to. And the more you think about that, the harder it is to believe, especially by the time you reach the ending, because the emotional payoff only works if the setup makes sense, and it doesn't. So what you're left with is something that feels incredibly well made, but structurally unstable. And that's where the obsession stops helping, because no amount of precision, no amount of perfect framing or control, movement, or whatever can fix a story that doesn't fully work. And then there's Alien 3, which is a completely different kind of problem, because this isn't a solid movie with cracks in it. This is a movie that never had a stable foundation to begin with. The production was chaotic. Scripts were being rewritten while they were shooting. The direction kept changing, and you can totally feel that. Alien 3 doesn't know what it wants to be. You know, it introduces ideas and it abandons them. The tone shifts and it never fully locks onto anything. And in that kind of environment, Fincher's strengths don't have anything to latch onto, because obsession only works when there's something solid to refine. And in Alien 3, there isn't. So instead of elevating the movie, that precision and that focus just sits on top of something unstable, and it looks controlled, but it never feels grounded. And then you get to something like The Killer, which is where that obsession starts to turn on itself, because this time, the story isn't necessarily the issue. And it isn't that the story is falling apart. It's how everything feels. It feels too controlled. Every frame is clean. Every movement precise. Every beat completely measured. And after a while, you start to feel it. Not the story, but like this control. The thing that's supposed to be invisible isn't anymore. It's like the movie has been refined and nitpicked and broken down too much. And that creates distance for the viewer, because instead of disappearing into the story and falling into this world, you're aware of how constructed it is. And that's where Fincher's obsession breaks down. It becomes the thing you notice. In The Killer, it feels like you've over-edited a photo. At first, it improves it, but the more you adjust it and the more you refine it, the more unnatural everything starts to feel. And eventually, you can't unsee it. And that's what happens in The Killer. Instead of pulling you in, it starts pushing you out, because every scene starts to feel almost plastic. The world feels artificial, and it feels too over-edited, like someone who can't stop looking at every single frame and pointing out every single flaw, or what they perceive as a flaw, although that flaw is what makes it feel real in the first place. They can't stop over-editing, and they can't stop touching up every frame. And that's the real problem with this obsession. Not that it exists, right? But where it's aimed. Because this type of obsession, the Fincher obsession, it's powerful. It can sharpen a scene, it can elevate a performance, it can turn something good into something great, but only if it's working with something that already holds itself together. Because the audience doesn't experience the movie the way that it's made. They're not tracking the number of takes. They're not noticing these tiny adjustments. What they feel is whether the story works or not. They feel the pacing, they feel the tension, they feel whether or not the story is coherent. And if those story pillars aren't there, all that precision doesn't fix the problem. It just makes everything around it more noticeable. And that's why Fincher's best movies feel so locked in, because his obsession is aligned with those stories. And it's why his weaker ones feel off, not because they aren't well made, but because all of that effort is being applied to something that the audience doesn't actually connect with. Obsession can perfect a detail, but it doesn't guarantee that that detail matters. And at the end of the day, the story is the only thing that does. If you see it differently than me, let me know in the comments below. And if you want more breakdowns like this, subscribe. See ya.